I'm live. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. I am your host, Kevin Mears, the Paranormal Encyclopedia. I am, as it stands, alone tonight. Drew was unable to make it, and Brian is still unavailable. So you're going to be stuck listening to me for the next hour unless Beth happens to turn up. Before we get started, I want to, of course, give plugs to our two sponsors. Remember to check out Audible. Audible is a wonderful service where you can get a free get audiobooks every month for a low monthly fee. If you haven't done it before, if you want to sign up and give it a try, you can go to audibletrial.com/paranormale, audibletrial.com/paranormale, and you'll be able to get a free month's trial with a free audiobook. You can cancel it at any time. If you do cancel the free month trial, you do get to keep the free audiobook, so it's a pretty good deal. I use it myself. There's thousands, if not millions, of titles on there. My co-host Brian McKinley, all three of his books are on there. I definitely recommend checking it out. Now, the other thing I want to talk to you guys about before we get into the show is our other sponsor, which is NordVPN. A VPN, it stands for Virtual Private Network, if you wonder what I'm talking about. It is a form of security that you can use when you're surfing the web to encrypt. It's great for a lot of things. It'll encrypt your private information, your social security number, credit cards, things like that. And the encryption they're using is military grade. Basically, instead of normally you just sign on the internet and you're signing onto the internet and then you're signing on to one of their servers and then using the internet from there. So everything's going through double lines of encryption, which means it's extremely safe. Like I said, military grade. The other advantage this gives you is wherever, if you're signing in, say you live in China. China's famous for, of course, the Great Firewall. It blocks a whole ton of websites. Well, you can live in China, but pick whichever server in the world, and there's over 4,000 you want to sign in on. So you can sign in on a server in the United States, which means you're no longer affected by China's firewall. You can sign in for any of these other servers. If your country blocks certain things, you can use it. I'm a huge advocate of free speech, and I think this is a wonderful aspect. If you're using your computer on a work network or a school network, and you got to look something up. Now, I'm not advocating, playing games at work or, when you're supposed to be doing your schoolwork. But if you need to look something up and it's blocked for some weird reason, but you've got to do that research for your school project. If you're working in a hotel, maybe you need to look something up for a guest. The NordVPN will allow you to get around that as well. It's a really great service, and it's very affordable. There will be links at the end of the show in the description to go to both. audibletrial.com/paranormally, audibletrial.com/paranormally will let you do the Audible free membership. The other one I'll have to post later. It'll be in the description on YouTube, and it will also be a pinned comment. It's long and complicated and strings of letters, which is why I'm not going to try and read it over the air. But okay, that covers the advertising for the evening. I want to get into the topic. So anyone who follows us on Facebook, and if you don't, you should, remember the Paranormal Encyclopedia, that's how you'll find us on Facebook, knows I was saying that tonight's topic was going to be paganism and Satanism and LaVey Satanism and what the difference is and the similarities between the three are. At the time I was having this discussion with Drew Rosansky, who's been filling in as co-host again for the last few weeks, and Drew wasn't available tonight. He's got to get some work done in his car. We've all been there. Trust me, I just blew 2 flats last night. But that being said, I don't feel like I should be trying to cover this particular topic on my own. While I can do a good job, as a Christian, I feel I come across as somewhat biased. And I think this is one of the situations where it'd be better to have Drew or Beth or another person who's part of the pagan community to balance my side of the discussion. So I decided to pick a different subject for tonight, which is one I personally find quite fascinating, and is one I, as a Christian, and I think every other Christian or anyone or Jew or Muslim or anyone else who believes in the idea of an omnibenevolent, meaning all-loving, all-good God, struggles with, which is what is known in philosophy as the problem of evil. If anyone doesn't know, the problem of evil is, simply put, the question of why does a loving God allow evil to exist? There's a simple explanation to this that I ascribe to that deals with the human side of evil, which is well, as loving God, God allows free will, and if you're going to allow free will, that means you inevitably have to allow people to do evil things. I think this covers human evil very well, but there's a problem here. There are, which is things that, well, maybe not in the most conventional sense of the word, or are not evil. Like a tornado is not inherently evil. Evil requires intention. A tornado is a disaster, is an act of nature. It can kill a lot of innocent people, but there's no, the tornado isn't trying to kill people. It's just a result of natural process. Why does God allow tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, disease, famine, and all of these other horrible things that kill even innocent children when they've done nothing to deserve it? Now, this is a really good question. And there's no easy answer, but I think a lot of it actually comes back to free will. And let me explain why. Now, the most obvious example of my point here is the question of famine. Right now in the United States, and go ahead and hop on Google if you don't believe me, we produce a surplus of food. That means the United States as a country not only produces enough food to feed every man, woman, and child in the United States, it produces more than we need. But people are, never mind the fact people are starving all over the world. They're starving in Africa, starving in the Middle East. People are starving here. And we produce more food than we need. Why it's not going is there's a lot of reasons for that, coming down to economics, capitalism. They don't want to give out food. They want to pay. They want to be paid for food. You get into problems of sell-by dates and storage problems and things of that, and transportation. Transportation is a huge issue in the United States in terms of getting food to places, and the amount of gas that's expended and the trucks that are required to move things. It gets phenomenally expensive to do this, but it still comes down to choices people are making. And if you look at other countries, if you want to look at parts of Africa and the Middle East, you have, I hate to say this because, this is not indicative of the entire Middle East. It's not indicative of the entire Africa or Asia or any other part of the world. But in a lot of the countries where these problems are the most serious, are run by dictators and despots and other totalitarian regimes. And when the people in power hoard the food and make sure only their supporters and those loyal to them are being properly fed, guess what? There's a lot of people that are going to starve. And again, this isn't an argument that the person starving is choosing to starve. That's ridiculous. There are people that make that argument, and I think it's completely ridiculous. It's an argument that other people around them are making these choices. And it doesn't just cover famine. That's another real good example and it touches on something we've talked about more than once on this show, is disease. In 3 countries in the world, Nigeria, Pakistan, and I forget parts, not even all of Pakistan, parts of Pakistan, and one other country I can't think of off the top of my head, polio is still a problem. Why? Because the rest of the world still has widespread vaccination, and these countries don't. The people, and particularly the people in power, are making a choice not to vaccinate. And they're trusting ridiculous nonsense about how vaccinations are an evil attempt to sterilize the people and some sort of mind control from the West to destroy them, which is all ridiculous. But again, children, innocent children are suffering because of these choices. Even more fundamentally than that, through the Middle Ages, the choice not to focus on the rejection of the scientific method, the rejection of the discoveries that had been made under the Greeks and the Romans, some of the herbalist discoveries that had been made in the time period, caused suffering. The fact that it was considered in parts of Europe at various times in history, that bathing frequently caused disease, which of course we know is ridiculous. But that choice, the choice not to bathe regularly, that cultural decision was it caused death, caused suffering. And you can see the outgrowth of the point I'm making in modern society because of the fact that in the first world, in the United States, for example, in most of the rest of the first world countries, child mortality rates are lower than they've ever been. People live longer than they ever have. And I mean, people live longer today than any other time unless you go back to like biblical times before the flood, where they lived hundreds of years. That tells you something. And how much difference could we have made if different choices were made further back? And how much better the world could be if people made better choices now? And there's huge... I'm brushing the surface of these issues. I mean, we could talk about genetically modified food and the way the rejection of that has directly impacted starvation in various parts of the world. I mean, people make... The choices people make is a direct influence on their lives and not on the lives of others. And a lot of the time, even with what we consider natural disasters, it's not an act of God. Or if it is an act of God, it's being complicated by the fact people react poorly to it. Yet another good example of this point would be natural disasters. Historically, this goes back and forth, but today we have excellent technology to tell us when an earthquake is going to happen, where it's going to happen. We can tell when a hurricane is going to hit. We're going to usually tell when tornadoes are going to hit. And I hate to say this, and I have a great deal of empathy for the realities of the situation. But, when Katrina hit New Orleans, it wasn't a shock. They knew it was coming. People either chose not to or were unable to evacuate. And, there was we could definitely talk about mismanagement on the government level and other things that went into why people who wanted to evacuate couldn't. But a good many people remained in the city that should have gotten out. And even for that matter, you built a city essentially they built the city entire city inside of a bowl. It's not a huge shock that it flooded. There's so many problems that went into that were made that are the product of choices people make. Now, I'm certainly not advocating that everything we're to blame for everything. Things do occasionally happen. People can't control. People are attacked by animals. There are some horrible diseases out. I mean, there's some truly horrible parasites and diseases in the world that we don't have cures for or treatments for. But again, and there's a thing I've talked about before, less so on here, although this may be a logical segue into it. But I've talked about on my YouTube channel about the fact that I support what's called Theistic Evolution. The idea that God uses evolution as part of his creation. But because of that, I don't take the story of the book of Genesis and the 6 days of creation and Adam and Eve literally. But I think if you consider the story as a parable, which is my argument, you can make a case that in doing so, there's a lesson to be learned. In fact, there's multiple lessons to be learned. And I think, honestly, the most obvious lesson to take from the story is that, and this is true of other stories too. If you look at the story of Pandora's box from Greek mythology, I think there's the same basic idea of that man is responsible for much. We are the architects of our own problems in many ways. Suffering came into the world when Adam and Eve chose to eat of the fruit they were told not to eat of. Suffering came into the world when Pandora chose to open the box. So I think most evil in the world can be traced, or the complications and severity of most evil in the world can actually be traced directly or indirectly to human choice and human free will. Just because of not because we choose to cause disasters, not because we choose to cause calamity and death and destruction. Although often enough, obviously we do. I mean, if you want to talk about war, about pestilence and famine, they're both, you have a war, war often leads to the other two. Hence, one of the arguments about the symbolism of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, war, famine, pestilence, and death. Technically, it's conquest, war, famine, and pestilence together as one, and death. People conquer, there's war. War brings about famine and pestilence, and the war, the famine, the pestilence, and the conquest all eventually lead to to mass death and suffering. But again, it's choice. It all comes back, all of this comes back to choice. And because I need to pause it for a second to gather my thoughts and figure out where I'm going from here, let me give out the phone number in case anybody out there would like to call in. It is 609-807-2492, 609-807-2492. You can find the number at the bottom of your screen, right under Paranormal Encyclopedia. Feel free to call in if you have any questions or comments on this topic, or for that matter, on anything else. We're kind of in an open topic night. If you don't want to call in, you can feel free to contact me through the chat on Facebook or on YouTube. I have both open on the computer next to me. I'll be happy to respond to your question, to read out your questions there. I'll also take the second to say hello to River Arlen, Glenn Chan, and Shannon, all of whom are friends of mine that have turned up in chat. And I always appreciate the support, folks. But so one of the other things that I think is interesting to discuss. So even if we take the story of Adam and Eve as figurative, there is still this point of the other point of what I think it symbolizes that I think relates here, which is humanity's inability to serve even in a perfect world. Adam and Eve were given everything. No disease, no ample food, no pain, no suffering. And they're given one rule. Don't eat that one thing. Anything else, don't eat the one thing. They didn't follow the one rule. Now, again, figurative and symbolism is more important. Even if you wanted to say it's literally true, I think that the lessons of the story are more important than the literal story. But look around at the society we live in today. Look at the rich. Look at the powerful. Look at the people in political positions of power and trust. Are people who have everything, every material thing they want, on the whole, more ethical or less ethical? Are they more humble? Are they more willing, more charitable? Now, don't get me wrong. I am not, by no means am I saying that rich people are all evil. That's absurd. There are rich people who do wonderful things. Directly relating to another topic I've already touched on, keep in mind that what's his name? Bill Gates. Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are actively involved in trying to wipe polio off the face of the earth. And that's a really good, worthwhile goal. And it's something one of the richest men on the planet. As I understand it, he was at one time. He is no longer the richest person in the world. But he is dedicating time and money and effort toward this goal. And it's an achievable goal. We did this with smallpox. There are rich people who do good, great, wonderful things. But there are a lot of rich people who are complete jerks. There are certain rich people in high positions of political power that do all sorts of morally questionable things. I'm not naming any names here. I think you all know who I mean, though. So I think that there's an old belief, and I think there's truth to it, of this idea that life is sort of a test. There's a conventional, it's a test of, test of faith, and I think it is to a point, but there's also just the test of morality. I mean, if you want if you, I would say a way to look at it is, it's like, if you want to be able to live in a perfect world, you need to show that you're worthy of living in a perfect world. Not by, and I'm not advocating that this means you have to follow my religion or anyone else's religion, but in terms of your actions, in terms of your moral outlook on life, in terms of the things that you do, you know, and here's another thing along with that. Can you have a perfect world inhabited by not just imperfect people? Well, in point of fact, you can't really have it. If you want an absolute perfect world where nothing ever goes wrong, you need perfect people, which is never going to happen. But can you have even a great world, a pristine world, a world with less suffering, without people who are trying their darndest to be better people? This is one of the fundamental problems I see in a lot of philosophies that hold that there is no hell, there's no punishment, there's no suffering. You know, everyone just goes to heaven when they die. Now, there is certainly the school of thought that when you die, you go to purgatory. You know, in Judaism, there is a hell, but the hell is a little more like the Catholic idea of purgatory, where you have to go there to cleanse the sins you've committed in life, and then you can move on. You find similar ideas in Eastern philosophy, in Buddhism, Hinduism. But again, there is this idea, at least in some of the fluffy bunny neo-pagans and many Christians, that nope, we just all go to heaven when we die. Which sounds nice in theory, until you think about, so you mean the 9 to 12 million people he ordered killed are sharing an afterlife with Adolf Hitler? This sounds like a good idea to you? And I'm not necessarily advocating for eternal damnation here, but when I talked in the live stream I did for YouTube a couple of weeks back about the nature of evil, I also talked about the flaw, you know, the inherent concept a lot of people, Christian and non-Christian, and on the whole, I think it's a good idea, advocate as a measure of goodness is in terms of being compassionate towards other people and treating people as you wish they to be treated. This is what, you know, the golden rule, which can be found in pretty much every religion and major philosophy in the world. And I think or for that matter, there's a principle of agapism, you know, treating everyone with love. And I think these are fine ideas. I think as a foundation of ethics, it's a really good place to start. It's certainly Christ's beginning of ethics. You know, he said there were 2 rules: love thy neighbor as thyself and love God. So I'm not faulting the idea, but the problem is by itself. Well, what about justice? What about people who choose to go, you know, what are the consequences for going against that moral principle? If you're going, you know, because in a system based purely on compassion, what do you do with murderers? What do you do with torturers? What do you do to prevent them from continuing to commit those actions? For that matter, what do you do to deter others from committing those actions? There are plenty of good ethical answers to this, in my opinion, but you have to step away from this core idea of compassion to get there. Because yes, there's not abandoned entirely. You want to act with compassion towards the victims, and you want and I'm not certainly saying you need to be completely callous toward, you know, I'm not saying let's go torturing these people or anything. So there's a degree of compassion towards the perpetrators, but something still needs to be done. Otherwise, you know, on the simplest level, otherwise you're just going to do it again. And you could make an argument, and people have, that when you die, you get the negative parts of your personality are all wiped away. So basically, which to me implies that you're saying when you die, you become a slave. You lose your ability to make choices. You lose your personality. That works just fine in Eastern religions, where the ultimate goal of the cycle of reincarnation is to become part of the universal whole, and your sense of self ceases to exist. But, you know, from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, in most other parts of the world, we tend to think we continue. My personal experience of spirits is that personality continues after death. I'm not an advocate of the idea of nirvana, of this idea that we become part of God and everything else ceases to exist, or we rather cease to exist. And without that, if you still assume free will, and I believe free will exists for those in the afterlife as well as those on Earth, I think that's crucial to understanding why God allows spirits of the dead to return. So if you still have this, and there's no punishment, if everybody goes to the same place, what stops a true sadist, someone who gains pleasure and gratification from inflicting pain on others, from continuing to do so, particularly if given a situation where the person that they're torturing won't die, which means, wait, the fun doesn't stop. They can just keep going and continuing to gratify it while that person may suffer, and nobody wants this, which relates back to the problem. So I think there is an inherent point of free will. I do think, I will say, and I've mentioned this on the show, and I've mentioned this more, I even did a review of this in a YouTube-specific broadcast I did, a really interesting look at the nature of evil and the nature of hell, of the afterlife, is C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. If anyone's wondering, the reason why it's called The Great Divorce is William Blake, one of the great romantic poets, famously wrote a poem called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Lewis, in the introduction to the book, comments that he can't begin to guess at what the great poet meant by the marriage of heaven and hell, or all of its implications, but he named his book The Great Divorce, specifically in relation to this idea of the marriage of heaven and hell. And it talks about a bus trip taken by souls in hell to heaven. It's on many levels, it's a very interesting look at the afterlife. Partly because in this circumstance, hell is a city. It's a massive city stretching out endlessly on the edge of twilight. And it's full of houses. And the damned live in the houses. And the longer they stay, the more they withdraw from each other, and the houses move further and further out until people from ancient times, the most recent person anyone in the stories has ever gone out to visit and come back was Napoleon Bonaparte. And it took thousands of years of journeying to get out there and come back. The distance was like in light years, it was so far. But of course, in spirits, time has very little meaning to them. And they just found this huge opulent mansion. And when they looked inside, Napoleon's just walking back and forth and back and forth and back and forth in a room, muttering to himself in French. And the idea here being that ultimately it's the evil turning in on itself. It's the person getting lost in their own mind and their own desire and their own sin. But at any rate, they get on this bus and they're taken to another place. And the other place, this is the thing. It's a gross simplification to call the city on the edge of twilight hell, and it's an oversimplification to call this other place they go heaven. This other place is natural beauty, rivers, lakes, forests, grass, no human habitation, but each of the people get out and everything is real in a way that they aren't, to the point that the blades of grass cut into their feet. The water is like diamonds. The waterfalls are deafening. And they're met by these other people, these glowing, beautiful people that originally the narrator mistakes for angels, but they're actually just people who are trying to guide them onward. And it becomes a question of trying to get them out of their own heads. And the one that ultimately approaches the narrator approaches him, and they have this discussion, outlining this idea that the place that they're in now, the place they came from is the shadow of death. The place they're in now is the shadow of life. That people are being given, that these people. Hey, Beth. Hi. Our producer just walked in. So Drew couldn't make it. Brian is still MIA. Okay, so you're caught up. Yes. Cool. What? You're saying about the book? Yes. So, but these people are being given a choice. If they can get out of their own heads and relate to other people. There's a particular poignant case of a woman who, her first reaction on reaching heaven is, where's my son? Why can't I talk to my son? Why are you keeping me from my son? And as the story progresses, and as she interacts with this person who turns out to be her own brother, you find out that this woman was so obsessed with her son, she ignored everyone else. She ignored her husband. She ignored her other children. And it clearly becomes this unhealthy, nearly Munchausen level relationship with her son. What? Nearly. Well, she doesn't actually start trying to kill him or to get attention for herself or anything like this. That's Munchausen by proxy. True. But it's this completely unhealthy relationship that shut everyone else out of her life. And she's not being condemned because, she wasn't Christian. She's not being condemned because, she wasn't the right kind of Christian. She's being condemned by her own choice not to care about anything else and only care about this one relationship and how important this one relationship is, to the detriment of the person that she claims to love, no less. Because it's not healthy to have this kind of obsessive relationship with someone, am I right? But they're given this choice, and they ultimately have the ability to, as they travel on, as they accept these things, as they grow. And there's a reason I keep coming back to this growing inside themselves, and I'll get to that in a minute. The reality around them will become less painful, it becomes easier and easier, and eventually they will go to heaven. And there's this great comment that the city where they all came from, this hell, will be basically to the people that eventually move on. They'll look back at it as merely purgatory. Not only that, they'll look back at their lives. The people that ultimately go to heaven will look at everything that has ever happened to them in this new light, where they've always been in heaven from the moment they were born. Because all the things that were wonderful about their life will be what they remember, and all the suffering that they endured will just exist to contrast with, to make the good things that happen to them stand out better. Because without suffering, there's the other point that goes into the nature of good and evil, that without suffering, how do you understand pleasure? Without that contrast, it doesn't mean all that much. Would joy mean anything to a person who's never experienced sorrow? But on top of that, and possibly the best concept is, so this huge city that encompassed light years in distance, and they came out of this crack in to the narrator seemed like this huge yawning crack in the earth. And he's looking around and he can't see it, and he asks his guide, and his guide plucks a single strand of grass from the ground and uses the tip to point to this tiny little crack in the earth, barely visible. As big and enormous and important as this hell, because like I said, to the people that eventually move on and find heaven, that hell will actually be purgatory. The people that never accept the reality and decide to go back, and many of them unfortunately do, they'll eventually realize they were always in hell. And the only thing that will matter to them is their own suffering and their own pain and their own emotional states. But this point, I think, in that all of the negative, particularly the negative parts of our emotions, our hatred, our fear, our disgust for other people, or our prejudices, are ultimately small and petty. And out of petty things comes horror, things of great horror. But at their core, a lot of it comes back to just getting caught up in yourself and not dealing, not accepting the importance. There's a concept from one of my favorite moral philosophers. I don't agree with him a lot, but I like his ideas. but his name's Immanuel Kant. Kant was an ethical philosopher. He offered two principles of ethics. One, which sounds really good on the surface, but it doesn't work in reality, which is the concept of universalism. Universalism holds that an act can only be ethical if it can be elevated to a universal principle. Now, on the surface, it sounds great. We'd all pretty much agree, thou shalt not commit murder is a really good universal standard. On the surface, thou shalt not lie sounds like a really good standard, because society, if lying was tolerated, society would break down pretty quickly. On the other hand, why no SS officer, I don't know where any Jews are. Most of us would consider that moral. Saving people from the SS is a good thing. But according to Kant's universalism, it's not, because that basic act of lying can't be turned into a universal principle that can apply in every situation, which is why, in my opinion, this philosophy doesn't work. Now, his other argument, which I think does actually work, is a much simpler principle of action. You should, when dealing with other people, treat people as having inherent self-worth instead of simply being a means to an end. And it's unlike the universalism thing. I find it personally find it impossible to think of a situation where treating someone as if their only purpose in life is to fulfill your end goal is a moral action. To act morally towards other people, we have to respect their feelings. We have to respect their desires and the fact that they have a right to those things. I think we can all agree on that. And I think that's very much what Lewis is getting at here. It's that concern for everyone else, not just for the self. It is a really great book. It's The Great Divorce. You can find it on Audible if you want to give it a trial for the Audible trial that I mentioned at the beginning of the show. And he's done a lot of other good books. I mean, Lewis is probably most famous for having done the Chronicles of Narnia. But in my opinion, some of his most fascinating writing doesn't take place on the other side of wardrobe. And The Great Divorce, which I've just spent the last, 10, 15 minutes talking about, the Screw Tape Letters, where it's a demon, an old elder demon explaining to a younger demon how to corrupt a human being. Mere Christianity, where he presents what I think you call the moral argument for God, the idea that because we all have a universal understanding of morality, it was put there by God. And actually, I think this is an interesting topic to get into as well, which is, I believe, and there are many people, including many, mostly atheists, but not exclusively, who disagree with me, that there is there's a basic core of morality that is universally held. Now, Lewis agreed with me, and said that was created by God. I think you can reasonably make an argument that it's a byproduct of evolution as well. And being a theistic evolutionist, I don't see the two as mutually exclusive. But pretty much everyone in every culture has a basic understanding that murder is wrong, that stealing is wrong, that lying is wrong. Even social animals act in ways that show that they have an understanding of compassion. They have an understanding that certain behavior is inherently wrong. Humans have a remarkable, as sentient creatures, and as far as we know, the only sentient creatures, we have a remarkable ability to justify why, in this one instance, it's okay for me to do the wrong thing, where it would normally not be, but we still know that we're doing the wrong thing. Even most sociopaths and psychopaths, I would argue, understand that what they're doing is wrong. They don't care. Or often more specifically, they see themselves as the only real being in the world, so what they do to the playthings around them is irrelevant. I think a good argument for why this is true on a fundamental level is, even if you asked the most depraved sociopath on the planet, a serial killer, they would see it. They might see it as morally acceptable for them to kill other people. I doubt any of them are going to say it would be okay for you to kill them. they at least recognize their own life has value. Even again, it's the human ability to justify. Kant also made an argument about what he called perfect evil or diabolical evil, because of the question of, can humans do something wrong just because it's wrong? And he argued that they can't. Only a demon or the devil can do evil for the sake of evil. There's always some deeper motivation for it. I would agree with him about humans. I don't agree with him about demons. I don't think anything in the universe does the wrong thing just because it's the wrong thing. These beings, we make choices. We always have some reason why we think it's okay to do this. Or, and some of them are unbelievably petty. A lot of sociopaths and things like that may kill people just because they derive personal gratification from doing so. Satan, in my opinion, the main reason Satan is doing everything is kind of to God. But even then, I think there's even, and I guess this is maybe the last topic to get into since we're on the 15-minute mark, or the last 15-minute mark. But although I want to give the phone number out one more time, 609-807-2492, 609-807-2492, which is so the last topic I want to go into, unless anyone wants to call in and has a question, comment, and if you don't want to talk about this, feel free to call in about something else. I mean, we're not hard set to one topic. We can cover anything. But here's an interesting question. I think most people don't consider when they talk about the nature of evil and even the problem of evil, which is, what about what's properly termed preternatural evil? Supernatural evil supernatural evil is a contradiction. To most Christians, would be a contradiction in terms, because keep in mind, supernatural in its proper original context only means actions deriving from God. So if you consider God omnibenevolent, all good, he doesn't commit evil acts. Preternatural would be the proper term for the activity of demons and Satan, because it makes sense above or beyond the natural. But when you look at the nature of Satan's motivations, why he fell, there's a lot of speculation about, well, why did Satan fall from grace? If you want to go straight to the strict Bible, it talks about Lucifer and talks about pride, and it talks about I will set my thrones above the heavens, I will be like the Most High, I will, and again, it gets back into this idea I've been talking about with Lewis's work about the inherent selfish nature of evil, because it's all about, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to be this so great, I'm going to be so important. As one Christian theologian put it, Satan gave his 5 I wills and God gave his 1 no you won't. But I don't think Satan just does things because he wants, because they're wrong. I think there's partly a desire on his part to prove that to God that he was right all along. Another theme you can take from Genesis that is often interpreted into why Satan falls is that Satan has spent the entirety of human history saying to God that humans are a bunch of screw-ups. You see this in Genesis and the fact that we took the apple. You see this in the book of Job. Pretty much the entire book of Job is Satan trying to explain to God that Job wouldn't really be loyal to him if the situation wasn't perfect, and being given the ability to take things away from Job just to test that. It's a very odd book of the Bible, needless to say. But even his name, in Hebrew, he's the accuser. And in Jewish theology, Satan isn't usually a fallen angel, and although some cases he is. He's the prosecuting attorney of heaven. He's the one who's going, no, your creation is a screw up. Here's why. This is translated into some Christian theology as well, where his job is based, God takes this person and wants them to go to heaven, and Satan's going, nope, he's mine. Here's why. You can't have him. I get to keep him. But while I don't think that's the reason for Satan's fall, I think Satan's fall came before the creation of man. and was ultimately just I want to be God, and as long as you're God, I can't be God, so I'm going to beat you and take the throne, which, needless to say, failed spectacularly. But when there is this belief among some Christians, and it's more prevalent in Islam, that what actually set him off was the elevation of man, because of course the Bible says that God made man in our own image, not his own image. It's an interesting thing about Genesis that throughout the first chapter in particular, God's always referred to in the plural, not the singular. That's not just the translation in English. In the original Hebrew, the term for God being used is Elohim. And as I've covered on the show before, in Hebrew, the suffix im, I am, indicates plurality. So you're dealing with multiple beings, not a single being, which is that's a whole topic into itself. And we're going to get into I think we're going to wind up getting into that the next time we get Drew on the show, because it relates to the topic we were originally going to talk about tonight. But regardless, you have this idea that God created man in his own image, or their own image, or however you want to put it. Whatever that means, and there's a lot of debate about what that means. And I'll get to what I think it means in a minute. But angels weren't. Angels don't have whatever intrinsic quality Genesis is talking about. That Satan is jealous of that, and that because God set man above the angels. And if you read, later in the Bible, in the New Testament, it even says that man will actually sit in judgment on the angels. So we clearly have a higher position in the authority, and Satan resented that, and that's ultimately why he fell. Which I don't think that's true, but I think Satan has a lot of resentment for man, because the thing is, Satan was created in the presence of God. From the moment Satan came into existence, he was always aware God existed. There's no point in so his situation in terms of his fall is very, very different. Humans, Adam and Eve, if you want to go back to the original creation, if you want to take the book of Genesis literally, Adam and Eve talked with God. They were aware of the direct presence of God. But most of us aren't. Most of us have to live by faith, which gives us a bit more leeway. Seems to give us a little bit more leeway in being screw-ups. Because let's face it, as a species, we screw up constantly. But there's a resentment of that, and there's a resentment of this special status that we have, and that he's basically spent all of human existence trying to tear us down. I think he's trying to tear us down, but I think there's a much more petty reason behind it. As I've said up before on the show, I'm not necessarily convinced that humans... I don't even know for 100% sure I would say this of demons either, but humans are condemned... I don't believe humans are condemned to hell forever, unless they choose to be condemned to hell. I think actual eternity in hell takes a knowing, willing choice to separate yourself from God. And ultimately, C.S. Lewis put it, I think, perfectly when he said, there are two types of people. There are people that say to God, thy will be done. And there are people to whom God says, thy will be done. God's not going to force himself on anybody. If people choose, the most basic state of the nature of hell, which is separation from God. If you choose to be separated from God, well, there's no way around that unless God decides to force himself on you, and he's not going to do that because of free will. But Satan is condemned to the worst possible of torments, because he doesn't have the excuse that he had to act on faith. He knew God existed. God was there from the beginning. And Satan knows that he's in for an eternity. He's going to pay for his many crimes. And the saying, misery loves company? I think that's Satan in a nutshell. I think he knows he's going down in flames, and he wants to take as many people with him as he can. It's petty, it's childish, and I think that ultimately in many ways is, as powerful as he is, as intelligent as he is, I think Satan is very petty and very, if I can't have it, nobody can. And I think that's kind of what you're ultimately running into. I think, and I know many theologians who would disagree with me. My mentor, the late Father Joe, often told me outright that this isn't true. I respectfully disagree with him. I'm not entirely convinced that fallen angels are damned, are forever damned yet. I think, as a Christian, I'm a very big believer in the idea of repentance and the principle of mercy. And if I believe that the worst human in human history, if you want to take his own word for it, that, by the way, would be Saint Paul of Tarsus, Saint Saul, who became Paul, who calls himself in the Bible the chief of all sinners. And he was a pretty terrible person. I mean, he executed Christians. He executed a lot of Christians, but he found salvation. If the worst of all people is still open to the possibility of redemption, and I believe, at least to a point, that I believe this, and it's one of the most basic reasons I consider myself a Christian, is I believe in the idea of redemption. I believe that however far you fall, if you honestly seek forgiveness, you can find it. Although, let me be clear, this is forgiveness in the divine sense, which means you're dealing with somebody who knows your heart. You can't. Seeking forgiveness is fire insurance because, oh crap, you don't want to pay. You don't want to pay the penalty for your crimes. Is not seeking forgiveness, but actual repentance, the actual realization that you have done wrong and you are sorry for it, I believe has spiritual power, and I believe that God looks upon that with favor, and that yes, that's why people have a chance, is because you have that ability to go, you know what, I screwed up big. That doesn't mean and repentance does not mean that you're exempt from consequences. But the consequence, it's just like in a human court case. If you commit a crime and you have no remorse, your punishment is usually much harsher than if you go before the judge and go, look, you know what, I did it, I admit I did it, I know what I did was wrong. And the judge honestly believes that. And I think, but again, it doesn't mean you get, okay, you killed 6 people, but you know what you did was wrong. Doesn't mean you're going to get a blank slate. But it might make the difference between life in prison and the electric chair or something of that nature. And even, biblically speaking, there's plenty of Christians that are probably, if there are any Christians still listening to me, there's plenty of them that are probably quite furious at me for daring to suggest the idea of purgatory. But if you read your Bible, it's very clear, hell is not, each is going to be rewarded according to their works. Which means hell is not the same for everyone there. There are degrees of punishment. And for that matter, there are degrees of reward, which goes back into the idea of God being a just God. God's not, a person who lived a mostly moral life, who made some big mistakes, is not going to be treated the same. Should not be treated the same as somebody who was killed millions of people for for the sake of his own sick pleasure. No one would call treating those two people exactly the same just. Even you want to go classic, eye for eye, tooth for a tooth. There is actually one last thing, because we are running out of time, but there's a last thing that does directly tie into this that I want to comment on, which is the power of forgiveness, which I think is one of the most misunderstood but important concepts in human philosophy. Christians are in our religion, we're real big on the idea that you need to forgive other people for the wrongs they do to you. Which tends to be taken as a passive action, as a passive response to something. The most famous example of it being passive is Jesus saying to turn the other cheek when you're slapped. What people don't realize about that is turning the other cheek in a slap, particularly in that time period, was a form of resistance. It wasn't rolling over. Think about it. If you're going to slap somebody, if you want to slap somebody and show them complete contempt you backhand them. Now, if I backhand you, and I come out, and whack. So my hand's over here. If you turn, and I slap you again, I'm going to slap you with the palm of my hand instead of the back of my hand. Now, if you slap somebody with the palm of your hand, for a moment, you're going to actually almost caress their face, which is not as disrespectful as a backhand. A caress is such an intimate gesture, and in Rome, how you slap somebody mattered. So, by turning the cheek, instead of just presenting the same cheek to be backhanded again, you were basically flipping off the person who slapped you without actively resisting them. But another time I've seen this, the time I've seen this most often question, this idea that we need to forgive those who wrong us, is when you look at victims of crime, of violent crime. Should a woman who's raped forgive the person who raped her? Yes and no. Now, if you get raped, does this mean you should associate with that person again? No. But there's the thing about hatred, the thing about anger, even when it's completely understandable and justified, and everyone, I have complete empathy for a victim who's has anger and hatred for the person who attacked them, and I'm not condemning them for that anger. But I want to make an observation about that. Especially if you're dealing with a serial rapist, when they rape a person, they're going to go on and rape another person. And for that, even if they get punished, they've raped other people before you. Given the chance, they'll rape other people after you. You're not that important to them. They're not going to be, unless you get them put on the death row or something, they're not going to think about you anymore. When you hate someone, when you have unreasonable, irrational anger at someone, you're giving them space to live in your head. And the odds are really good that most of the time, they don't care nearly as much as you do. While it is understandable, and I am not going to condemn someone for being angry when they've been horribly wronged, there is something healthy and healing about letting go of that anger. And acknowledging that they did it, forgiving them within yourself. That doesn't mean that they don't still face punishment. That doesn't mean that you don't want to see them behind bars. Because you know what? If somebody wrongs you, I'm willing to bet that you don't want to see that happen to somebody else. But when I talk about forgiveness in this sense, I'm not talking about, about condoning what they did. I'm not talking about ignoring or trivializing what they did. I'm talking about releasing your own anger and your own hatred for your own sake. And the power that has. Well, I will never fault a victim for not being ready to do that towards the person who victimized them. I think that the people that have reached the point where they have the personal emotional strength to do it deserve a great deal of respect. There is power in giving forgiveness to people who have wronged you. And that is not power you give them, it is power you take for them yourself. Because again, when you hate somebody, all you're really doing is you're giving them space in your head. Internalized hatred that you do, I'm not talking about overt racists, the people that actually discriminate it. But when you internalize hatred, the only person you harm is yourself. Especially, if somebody rapes you and you never see them again, they'll never know that you hate them so much. You'll never know how you feel. And if they knew, they probably wouldn't care. All you're doing is turning it on yourself. And that is my point, and that is the strength of giving forgiveness, is being able to release that. And again, if you're not I'm not condemning people who don't. This isn't condemnation. It's a bit of life advice about about yourself and your needs and what's ultimately going to be good for your own psychological well-being in the long run. And we are now at 7:30. I think this is, I could probably run a little longer knowing Gene, but I think this is actually a pretty strong note to end this on. When I wrap things up and talk about the sponsors one more time and do my usual closing, and then we can roll it out. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. I sincerely hope that people have enjoyed this journey down philosophical paths. It's a little different than what we usually do on the show. But lately I've been wanting to, I'm getting older. I want to leave more than just a legacy of this guy who talks about demons all the time, and get a little more into theology and philosophy. And so hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave me a comment. If you don't like what I'm doing, what I did tonight, if you'd rather see me, go on and tell more scary stories and deal with history and the other darker stuff that I do, please leave a comment as well. I honestly want to see feedback. I want to see what people like, what people don't like, what they want. Maybe would like to see me change about the show's format. So please feel free to like, comment, subscribe. Give me an I would ask, feel free to dislike if you honestly didn't like the content. I would honestly ask, if you didn't like what I did, please leave me a comment about why. Specifically because if you leave me a like, honestly a dislike, I have no idea if you just don't like my face, or if it's some philosophical thing that we disagree with. I have people that don't like my videos just because I think flat Earth is ridiculous. Give me an idea why you didn't like it, and it's something I can keep in mind in the future and maybe work to change. I can't promise I'm going to work to change. It depends on what it is. But try to get, leave me a sentence or two about why you didn't like it, or for that matter, why you did. I want to remind everybody again to check out our sponsors. There is, of course, Audible. Go there, audibletrial.com/paranormale, audibletrial.com/paranormale. 1 month free trial membership and a free audiobook can be yours just by going to that link, and it will help out the show enormously. And then also NordVPN link to come in the description. If you want secured military grade encryption on your computers, so your identity and information is safe, and you can access things that you might not be able to access anymore. Otherwise, tune in later tonight. The next show is still on, right? Yeah. So tune in after me. There's going to be a really great show called Age Out Angels on. It's a good show. The guy who runs it's a great guy. I definitely recommend giving him a listen. If not, remember, we'll be back next week, 6:30 to 7:30 on Thursday. Check us out on Facebook to find out what the topic will be next week. I am available. You can reach me on Facebook or YouTube. Or for that matter, technically we do have a Twitter account. If you have questions, comments, concerns, if you or someone you know is having problems with a violent haunting or even a regular haunting, believe it or not, I deal with those from time to time too. Feel free to reach out to me. There is no trouble. If I can't help you, which is always possible because I live in New Jersey, I can't get everywhere in the country, let alone the planet. If I can't help you, I will work to find someone in your area who can. Otherwise, like I said, like, comment, subscribe, maybe give it a share. And you can, if you already have a Patreon account and your internet security is good, you can always consider supporting us through our Patreon, patreon.com/demonology, patreon.com/demonology. That's going to do it for tonight. I want to thank everybody for listening. This is Kevin Mears saying good night and God bless. I think that was a good show.